world of Resident Evil is a scary place. It's a world where megacorporations develop devastating bioweapons and compete to make them stronger. A world where those same bioweapons not only have killed hundreds of thousands of people, but turned them into living nightmares. It would be easy to call the world of Resident Evil broken and corrupt, and if you lived there, you might wish that none of it existed at all. So what happens when one group decides to wipe the slate clean, with the very same bioweapons that those corporations created? Resident Evil Revelations is a story about power and corruption, as well as those who seek to undo it. And it all begins with the destruction of a city. Resident Evil is a long-established game series spanning over a dozen game releases, spin-offs, and movies, so why am I starting my review with the 19th game in the series? When I first played Revelations on Xbox way back in the day, it was the first horror game I ever played. At that point, I knew Resident Evil more through the movies than the games. Playing through it for the first time, my tiny middle schooler brain thought it was the scariest thing to ever exist. But I was hooked. That first section of the game, going through the dark sections of an abandoned cruise ship while being stalked through the vents, has always stuck with me. But horror is subjective, and as we grow up, we also grow out of a lot of our fears. Even so, there are many parts of Revelations that I still think hold up, despite its age and limitations. One of those limitations is that Revelations originally started as a title for the Pocket Console, the Nintendo 3DS. Because of this, Revelations does many things different from other entries in the series. One of the most notable things throughout your playthrough might be the
Previously
on Resident Evil Revelations.
Revelations gameplay is divided up into small bite-sized chunks, with many individual segments within a single chapter. Being on a portable platform, the developers most likely expected players to play small bits of the campaign every day, perhaps while commuting to work on public transportation, during lunch breaks, in the restroom, or winding down after a long day. The short segments are designed to make players feel that they are still making worthwhile progress through the story, and the soap opera intros serve as a quick way to refresh the player on a new day. It's a funny quirk of the game that also came over to home console and PC ports of the game, where many players would likely spend more time on a gaming session to play through the game, but I think it's ultimately a charming and harmless thing to leave in, helping to distinguish it from similar titles. The game also tries to take advantage of these segments by taking on a more TV-like format as well. The primary focus of Revelation's story is Jill Valentine, former member of the police force under STARS, survivor of the zombie outbreak in Raccoon City, and now a member of the anti-bioterror organization known as the BSAA. However, the mid-chapter segments also see the player switching between a number of different characters and locations, in stark contrast to previous Resident Evil titles. Because of this, Revelations has an interesting mix of horror and action, with Jill's segments primarily focusing more on horror, while the supporting characters lean more towards action. At first, I was kind of surprised at having these action segments in a horror game, but then I began to realize something. Most Resident Evil games have a save room, a place where the player can escape from the chaos for a time to save their game, manage their equipment, or just recover their sanity with the calming music. At least in the early game, these action segments kind of serve as an extended save room, a place to breathe in fresh air and let loose the steam that had built up during the tense horror segments. These segments can certainly be better balanced, as we'll explore later on, but they can serve as an excellent way to both take a break from the horror, but also leave the player filled with dread at having to return to it. This experience is unique among horror games, as often the horror atmosphere in them can be inescapable. The closest the player might get to safety are the occasional save rooms, or areas where friendly NPCs appear. Again, while I don't think the balance between these segments is great, I would like to see this idea perfected in a future game. So why isn't it balanced in this game? Well, I went through each segment of the game and categorized them as either action or horror, based on my own perceptions of the segment, and here's what I came away with. Of the roughly 23-ish segments in Revelation's 12 chapters, about 13 of those I saw as being more action-focused, with those segments putting more emphasis on giving you more powerful weapons, fighting through hordes of enemies, large action set pieces, time segments, and a general lack of horror atmosphere. 10 of those segments I saw as more horror-focused, with slower, more exploratory gameplay, a dreadful atmosphere, fewer enemies, and generally weaker weapons, as well as more horror-focused bosses. In a horror game like Revelations, I would probably want to see a balance more like 1/3 action, 2/3 horror. It would give enough action segments to keep the horror fresh when you return to it without dominating the gameplay like it does in the current version of the game. Another departure from standard Resident Evil gameplay is the removal of its limited inventory system. Many previous and future Resident Evil titles had a suffocatingly small inventory that required constant management by the player in order to have the correct items for each moment in order to beat the game. This system ensured that the player never had an excessive amount of power, as they must carefully weigh carrying key items, weapons, ammo, and healing items. Revelations doesn't have this inventory system, at least in practice. Inventory can still be limited, but now weapons, key items, ammo, and healing items all have their own separate upgradable inventories. The player can now hold up to a max of 3 weapons at any time, a generous amount of ammo, several healing herbs, and an unlimited amount of key items. Because of this, the player no longer has to carefully manage the items that they pick up, only the amount of each item that they have. Additionally, this gives the player access to more power. As with more weapons, ammo, and healing, they can act more aggressively instead of having to creep carefully around every corner. Their actions are now also less thoughtful, as they no longer have to weigh their resources against the situations they might encounter. I do wish that Revelations had the typical inventory management of previous games, at least in the more horror-focused segments with Jill, both to further differentiate between the action and horror segments, and to make the gameplay more similar to previous installments. Imagine not only going from a scary environment to an action one, but from being suffocated by your inventory to being a one-man army. It would show the desperation and smart thinking required to survive in the horror section, and increase the dread of losing all of your powerful weapons upon returning to it. Because of the player's access to a powerful arsenal and intermittent action segments, the horror of Revelations must be carried more through its environments and enemies. In terms of environments, I'll focus more heavily on the ones that appear during the horror segments, though I will bring up others that are of interest. For a large portion of the game, the haunting halls of the Queen Zenobia are home. With the style of the 1930s in mind, the Queen Zenobia is adorned in beautiful and grand architecture that still holds up as stunning environmental design to this day. The introductory halls are caked in a cold metallic glow, and with the relative silence compared to the raging storm outside, the Queen Zenobia immediately gives off the impression that you are welcome within its halls. These intro halls, you might notice, are the employee areas of the cruise ship. Unadorned, sterile, almost hostile workplaces where the crew of the ship will work to keep up the experience of a magical cruise for its guests. This is the perfect dark environment for horror. Outwardly hostile, claustrophobic, with danger possibly lurking around every tight corner or in a nearby vent. Combined with the somewhat awkward third-person perspective, this part of the ship is horrific in the best way. Reaching the guest areas of the ship, it almost feels as if you're no longer aboard a ship. The halls are adorned with beautiful wallpaper and wood carvings. Every free space seems to hold a framed painting, while small lamps give the hall an ominous orange glow. The extravagance of the Queen Zenobia only continues when the player encounters areas like this dining hall, or this grand hall, where the warm lighting exposes very regal architecture that wouldn't be out of place in some noble's mansion, but again, we're on a cruise ship. The warmth and regality of these areas belies the dangers that lurk in its halls. Because of the warm lighting, as opposed to the cold, dim lighting of the employee sections, the player might become more inclined to lower their guard, only to be caught out when turning a corner, or when a monster leaps out from hiding place. I think the only area of the ship that I can really criticize are these lower deck maintenance areas, and that's really only due to the lighting. The rest of the ship had a lot of care put into how the light affected the player's perception of the room they were in, whether it was the eerie blue glow of the employee areas or the warmth of the passenger areas. But these lower deck maintenance halls were left a bit too bright and bland with its lighting. Being below deck, flooded with water and full of heavy machinery, this place should have been the darkest and scariest part of the ship, but that isn't the case. Other than some minor gripes with this area, I think that the design of the Queen Zenobia is a perfect fit for a horror game, and it gives off some great atmosphere. Of course, what Resident Evil game would be complete without an evil hidden laboratory? In a complete tone shift from the vintage halls of the cruise ship, the employee corridors, and the mechanical underbelly of the ship, the laboratory appears perfectly clean, with massive metal walls and structures, laser walls, red lights, and a massive pool of blood. This whole lab is stereotypically evil, and while I don't find it too scary, I do think it's fun. You only spend a short time here, but for appearing near the climax of the game, I think it's great to see the reality of where all the evils on the cruise ship came from. Now, let's talk about the environments outside of the Queen Zenobia, which honestly can be quite the mixed bag. One of the best is a sunken ship you explore near the end of the game. Most of its halls have collapsed and filled with water, creating a dark, rusted wreck you have to swim through, all while avoiding enemies. Above the waterline, the ship's halls are dark, and while they share the same regality as the Queen Zenobia's, everything has been torn to shreds, with blood and dead, half-mutated bodies everywhere. The environment alone tells the story of the terrible fate that these now-dead people suffered, and the atmosphere is hauntingly morbid. This is an amazing horror environment, and all of this is just to build up to the game's final boss. However, we are now just about at the end of what I consider the horror environments in this game, so now we'll examine the upcoming environments through the lens of an action game. One of these action segments takes place in some frigid remote mountains. Unfortunately, aside from being a bit snowy, there isn't too much going on in these sections visually, which is made even worse by how linear they are. As opposed to the open and explorable sections of the Queen Zenobia, these mountain sections don't amount to much more than a backdrop for you to shoot hordes of enemies. There isn't anything wrong with these sections being littered, but they do have to make up for the lack of exploration with an interesting environment. Even an ancient game like Lost Planet, also published by Capcom, even it was able to make linear snow segments interesting by adding things to the snowy environment, like distant landscapes, frozen structures, as well as weather and snow deformation. Even worse, there is a military base that resides in these snowy peaks, which could be a really great backdrop to have some more exploration. However, this section is extremely linear as well, and we only ever get to explore a few rooms and halls. Now, maybe it's because I like games like Lost Planet so much, or because the game has much better explorable action segments, but I really wanted to see more from these snowy levels. One of the only interesting segments in the military base is this arena-like area where we have to hold off against waves of bioweapons as they come flooding in. It's a fairly small area with some verticality, where we have to stay on the move between platforms to stay safe, all the while attacking the enemies before they can reach us. It's a simple gameplay loop, but having more areas like this in the action segments, where the environment influences gameplay, would have improved this area's overall impression for me greatly. However, as it stands, these snowy environments are probably my least favorite section of the game, but thankfully, things improve from here. I think that the action environments that take place in the ill-fated offices of a Terra Grigia skyscraper can be given a lot of credit for addressing a lot of the criticism I had of the previous area. These environments appear during flashbacks during a bioterror attack on the city, where we blast our way through the destroyed offices as things get worse and worse. These previously mundane, cramped office spaces turn into death halls as scattered papers, overturned filing cabinets, and various other office supplies lay everywhere, blocking movement. I like these office spaces a lot more because they both fulfill their role as a backdrop for action without being dull. There's a surprising amount of detail in these offices, from the previously described office supplies scattered about, to scripted sections where we can see bioweapons as they climb up an outside window. These areas also have enough spaces for you to explore, while still being extremely linear. It's a good balance of linearity and exploration for such short sections. I think the only thing it's missing is a large arena area like the snow levels, with the closest thing being this reception area, but verticality isn't playing nearly a large enough role as it does in the other area. Still, it's not a bad section, with my only complaint being that sometimes the critters get stuck on pillars and desks. Overall, my impressions of the action-focused environments is mixed, with some interesting segments and detailed environments as well as some dull sections. However, there is nothing outright offensive, and these action segments are short enough that I can understand the developers not wanting to spend too much time fleshing them out. However, No environment would be complete without enemies to fill them. Being mainly set at sea, Revelation's cast of bioweapons are all twisted versions of drowned bodies, merged with the traits of sea life. Many share a lifeless, pale skin tone, with the only coloration coming from their skin being forcefully torn and stretched by their own mutations. One of the first enemies you might encounter is this simple, zombie-like creature that will shamble towards you, using its barbed hands to strike at you, or if close enough, grab you and attempt to suck you dry with its mouth, and not in the fun way. My first instinct was to shoot its head, a common mechanic in zombie games, and while it did work, I found it much more effective to shoot its hands, which would stun the creature. While stunned, its disgusting worm-like mouth pops out, allowing you to easily shoot it for big damage, or go full RE4 on it with a devastating spinning attack. These things are a great introduction to this game's monster roster. They're creepy, slow, move awkwardly, but have a satisfying and rewarding method for defeating them. The next monster the player might encounter are these things that will shoot barbed projectiles at the player. These projectiles go about as fast as your school's Chromebooks and hit about half as hard, meaning these creatures aren't too big of a threat on their own. A few well-placed shots to their head is enough to put them down. However, when placed with other enemies, they can become a real nuisance, as you have to keep an eye on them while dealing with other enemies, or risk taking shots from off-screen. It becomes a game about deciding whether to prioritize the enemies rushing at you or the ones shooting at you. Speaking of rushing, these praying mantis-looking critters like to do just that out of a morbid desire to turn you into a pincushion from hell. Their faces are their weak spot, which becomes especially vulnerable as they do their charging attack. So, as much as you might want to turn tail and run, it might be a better strategy to focus fire on their face before they get you. Among these spiky boys is one with a softer, more explosive edge, almost reminiscent of when corpses bloat due to the gases that build from decomposition. They'll often appear in tight corridors where it can be difficult to get away from them. Killing them is simple. A few bullets will do the job. The issue becomes killing them before they get too close, while also dealing with other enemies at the same time. Thankfully, their explosions have a fairly short range and can be used to deal damage to their friends as well, so there can be a lot of strategy involved when one appears. There are also these little critters that look much more like crustaceans than people. While you probably won't get a good look at them during gameplay due to them lurking in water, I think they actually have one of the coolest designs in the game. There are these awful humanoid crustaceans with armor plating, skull faces, and multiple arms. These things look awesome. What isn't awesome is that they like to pop out of the water at you and pull you under before quickly running away when unsuccessful. Much later in the game, you'll encounter these Shark Knight wannabes that will slowly lumber towards you to deal heavy devastation with their long, sword-like appendages. They have tough skin and a shield to block damage, with its main weak point being its stomach. However, attacking this point will eventually bisect the Shark Boy, leaving it standing as it sprouts lashing tentacles like the Ganados in RE4. One of the weirdest enemies for me were these things hanging on the wall here. They look like they're hibernating, something that you would expect to spring to life as soon as you walk past. Being set at sea, you might be surprised to learn that there's only one type of zombie fish. These things can be found both in and out of the water, and while they aren't especially dangerous in either situation, on land they become these annoying little ankle biters that can be easy to overlook as you fight other enemies. One of the last normal enemies you'll encounter in the horror section are these awful blood mutations. There's a lot of environmental storytelling with these things that I think is great, we'll look into that later, but in actual gameplay they're really simple. There's one gameplay section on land where they pitifully slither towards you and are put down with a few bullets. The other gameplay section sees them act almost like patrolling guards, where you have to swim in a way that avoids their scripted patrol. Moving on to the enemies that appear more in action sections, there are only really two, well, technically four, enemies that the game throws at you. First, you'll face off against these mutated wolves. The normal type is fairly weak but comes in numbers, so it quickly becomes a game of killing them all quickly before you become their chew toy. A well-placed headshot can easily stun them, if not outright kill them, with weapons bigger than a pistol. There are also these larger, darker wolves that take a lot more to put down and deal a lot more damage, often appearing like the leaders of the wolves you'll encounter. The other enemies you'll find are these hunter creatures, giant reptilian critters with large claws and a love of gymnastics. Much like the wolves, they come in numbers, but they pack a much bigger punch and can take a lot more punishment. Because of this, it becomes much more important to line up headshots, which will throw them into this hilarious stun animation where you basically clothesline them with your bullet. They also have a variant which can turn invisible, but act almost entirely the same. While it may appear like they completely vanish, they can still be shot, made easier by tracking the puffs of snow showing where they step. Just before they launch an attack, they'll become semi-transparent, making it easier to see them, so you have to quickly blast them or get gouged. Overall, I'm much more fond of the enemies in the horror sections as they're much more varied, and this variance provides a whole host of different situations where different enemy combos force you to engage the game in different ways. Compare this to the action segments, which just resort to throwing several enemies at you at once that all more or less act in the same way, and it can be easy to feel a bit bored during these segments. For me, this is one of the biggest blunders of the action horror balance. The horror segments take great advantage of its environment and enemy variety to create stressful situations for you to solve. Take this area for instance. You open the door and are immediately confronted on both sides by different enemies. The room is a small, cramped circle, and the paths aren't wide enough for you to simply walk around the monsters. You immediately have to decide what to do as both start to rush at you. Is it better to start shooting to try and stun them, or do you try to dodge past one, risking taking damage but possibly gaining yourself some breathing room? It's a simple scenario, but it gives you enough gameplay options to stay engaged and thinking about your actions instead of throwing hordes of enemies at you that you can simply gun down. Before, I briefly mentioned dodging, and it is one of two new gameplay mechanics that Revelations brings to the table. The dodge is an action that can only be performed as an enemy is attacking, so it has to be timed correctly or risk taking damage. This is a good risk-reward mechanic and beneficial in spaces where it's easy to get cornered, which this game has many of. It is also an essential mechanic to understand for boss fights, where the player must dodge an attack to expose an opening on the boss. The other new mechanic is the Genesis device, a high-tech scanning unit that allows you to obtain hidden resources from the environment. I honestly think this item has some super cool mechanics and some redundant ones. Let's start with the redundant. Items in previous Resident Evil games could be found organically in the game's environment, either actually visible in the game's world or through a small glint of light. The Genesis device takes this simple mechanic and adds several needless steps to it, that being you need to pull out the scanner, look around every single environment you're in, find an item, wait several seconds to scan it, and then put down the device and grab the item. Here, the Genesis device serves no actual beneficial gameplay purpose, especially when, after being scanned, the items can be seen in the game environment anyway. The cool part of the Genesis device is its enemy scanning mechanic and reward system. Enemies can be scanned both alive and dead, which slowly fills a meter that eventually rewards you with a green herb. Additionally, the meter fills faster the closer you are to an alive enemy, and slower for each repeat enemy in a row you have scanned. Many enemies also don't leave dead bodies, disintegrating on death, so the player is further encouraged to take risks to maximize their healing. One more interesting function of the Genesis device is that it can help you see obscured enemies, like those lurking in the underwater sections of the ship, helping you dodge or retaliate against them. From this point on, I'll be going into story spoilers, so if any of the things I've brought up so far have piqued your interest, I highly encourage you to check out the game. It has a story that can be cheesy at times with a lot of twists and turns, but was super fun to experience on a first playthrough. I'll also be going over the story in order of events, bypassing the many twists that this game sets up, to look at how well the story plays out. Without any further ado, let's get into it. The city of Terra was a city built on the edge of the Mediterranean Sea, designed to run entirely off of solar power due to its massive solar array and orbital satellite. And at the end of 2005, it was sank almost entirely into the sea due to a bioterror attack. Perpetrated by Il Veltro, an Italian bioterror group led by former teacher turned extremist Jack Norman, Terra Grigia became one of the most devastating biological incidents since Raccoon City. Like many terror attacks, Veltro targeted Terra Grigia because it was a powerful symbol, for the world, one of hope for a better and more sustainable future. For Veltro, a symbol of corruption and decadence. See, Jack Norman believed himself to be a symbol of judgment, one that will wipe the world clean of what he viewed as impurity. This could be seen through Norman's use of quotes from Dante's Inferno, with even the name Veltro being a reference to the Greyhound in the story, a symbol of Judgment Day. While on their own, Veltro would have struggled to commit such a heinous act, they received help from an unlikely source, the Commissioner of the FBC. The Federal Bioterrorism Commission, or FBC, should normally have no place in providing aid to the very kind of group it was made to destroy, but Commissioner Morgan Lansdale was playing a different, more selfish game. Lansdale wasn't someone that really cared about morals, only his own self-absorbed ambitions. To him, power was everything, and Veltro was a stepping stone to that power. While relatively small at the time, Morgan knew he could expand the FBC's power, and thus his own, by orchestrating a massive international bioterror attack, and Veltro was the perfect tool. After befriending Norman, Lansdale gave him 3 cruise ships, the Queens Zenobia, Semiramis, and the Dido, to help mobilize their attack on the city. The ships were loaded with bioweapons like Hunters, UAVs that would disperse toxins in the air, as well as the new T-Abyss virus. And just like that, the new monster that was Veltro was unleashed on the city. Quickly filled with mutated people and raging monsters, Terra Grigia became a war zone as the FBC was brought in to control the threat. It's here in gameplay that we step into the shoes of Parker Luciani as he and his partner Jessica desperately try to defend the FBC's remaining headquarters during the last day of the incident. After days of fighting, Lansdale was able to convince the EU that Terra Grigia was lost, and that drastic action had to be taken or risk losing other cities as well. And so, all FBC agents were told to evacuate, and the city's own solar satellite was used to burn the city away. It's during the sequence that we get a really interesting moment that shows a lot about Lansdale and his beliefs. In a conversation with BSAA Director O'Brien, whose organization was brought in as third-party observers, Lansdale says this:
"Let the heavens scorch the earth with justice."
These unilateral solutions of yours will only create a new Veltro. Perhaps a dozen of them.
Yes, there's the rub. Men like us can exist thanks to groups like that.
And he'll just let all those people die.
Are you finished now, Director O'Brien?
In this moment, after thousands have died or horribly mutated, and the city on the verge of destruction, Lansdale is ambivalent, almost thankful for Veltro and the attack. He doesn't care about the consequences of this attack, or any future attacks, other than the potential benefits it has for him. And in terms of benefits, Veltro no longer has any to offer. To bury any evidence of his collaboration, Lansdale sinks the Queen Dido remotely, which holds Veltro leader Jack Norman and many Veltro operatives, and unleashes several BOWs from containment on the other 2 cruise ships. At what seemed like their greatest victory, the beginning of their judgment on the world, Veltro is wiped out. With Veltro gone and Terra Grigia flash fried, there's no one left to point fingers at Lansdale. Except for one man, Clive O'Brien. In his talks with the egotistical Lansdale, O'Brien became ever more suspicious of his motives, especially with the activation of the city's solar satellite. And so, O'Brien began to set into motion a plan that would expose Lansdale and find the evidence needed to put him away for good. Lansdale's use of the satellite and the complete disappearance of Veltro proved he was an extremely cautious man, one that made sure there was never a loose end. But what would happen if there was? O'Brien hoped that the sudden reappearance of Veltro would cause Lansdale to slip up and expose himself. In order to create this illusion, O'Brien enlisted the help of FBC agent Raymond Vester. In order to create the illusion that Veltro had returned, Raymond recruited people who were sympathetic to Veltro and used them to search for the cruise ships used in the Terra Grigia attack. However, the plan went awry when the Queen Zenobia broadcast an old Veltro message, allowing Lansdale to track down its location. Out of fear that evidence against him would be found, he sent Raymond and his partner Rachel to investigate the Queen Zenobia, while he sent another team to scour the sunken Queen Dido. This mission was the perfect excuse for Raymond to find evidence against Lansdale, and after splitting from Rachel, he did so, donning a Veltro disguise to keep his cover. Being informed by Raymond of the Queen Zenobia's discovery, O'Brien knew he would need help and backup against the dangers on the ship. However, O'Brien was very aware that Lansdale might have his own mole in the BSAA, and so he placed his trust in two of his most experienced agents, Jill Valentine and Parker Luciani. This trust was well warranted, given that Jill had helped found the BSAA, and Parker had left the FBC after their failure to save the city. However, as an extra precaution, he sent them in under the pretense of rescuing another BSAA team consisting of Chris Redfield and Jessica Sherwatt, who had gone missing on the ship, investigating Veltro's trail. This is where the player gets their hands on gameplay for the first time, as Jill and Parker explore the seemingly abandoned ship, a notion which is quickly dashed as dead bodies are discovered and BOWs come pouring out of the walls. Raymond had been keeping tabs on the two since their arrival, and set up a trap for them that would both legitimize the threat of Veltro and keep them investigating the ship, as well as allowing him to move the pair deeper within. During this time, Chris and Jessica, who were in fact not missing, discovered Raymond's Veltro base before receiving contact from O'Brien, telling them that Jill and Parker had gone missing. Being close with Jill as another former member of STARS, Chris tells O'Brien that the pair will help in the rescue effort. Replacing them in the Veltro base investigation, O'Brien sends in the bumbling Jackass and Grinder, who quickly find that the Veltro agents were unable to contain several BOWs, making the base very dangerous. While investigating a crashed plane, they discover coordinates for a ship, and Chris and Jessica are immediately dispatched, thinking it is the Queen Zenobia. After recovering from Raymond's trap, Jill and Parker continue their investigation. To keep the two on the ship, Raymond destroys both the navigation system and communications, but not before broadcasting an unreleased Veltro threat, furthering the idea of their revival. During their investigation, Jill and Parker encounter many horrific monsters, but one of the scariest is probably Raymond's former partner, Rachel, who was ambushed and became a horrifying stalking monster. We first encounter her in this amazing sequence where she ambushes us from the vents, and we have to both fend her off and chase her down to receive a key she has. Even after putting her down once, she returns multiple times, showing how dangerous these bioweapons really are. Chasing the coordinates Jackass and Grinder pull from Veltro, Chris and Jessica arrive at a cruise ship and rush inside looking for Jill and Parker. While full of BOWs, they find the ship otherwise empty, because they are not aboard the Queen Zenobia, but the Queen Semiramis. A win for the BSAA in finding evidence against Lansdale, but a loss for Chris in finding his old partner. Meanwhile, Jill and Parker attempted to repair the Queen Zenobia after discovering flooding in the lower decks, nearly drowning in the process. After managing to re-establish contact with O'Brien, he warns the pair that Lansdale has activated Terra Grigia's solar satellite, and is moving it into firing position above the ship. While unable to stop the satellite, they are able to use an old Veltro UAV to confuse its targeting system, resulting in a very close call. Afterwards, Raymond confronts the pair in his Veltro disguise, trying to explain the links to Lansdale, but is shot by Jessica as she and Chris arrive on the ship. Before dying, Raymond tells Parker that Jessica must be Lansdale's mole in the BSAA. After this, both teams split up, with Jill and Chris heading deeper into the ship to investigate a possible lab, while Parker follows Jessica to the bridge. In the lab, Jill and Chris uncovered undeniable evidence of Lansdale's involvement in the Terra Grigia incident, as well as his horrible experiments on the ship and their subsequent cover-up, with the scientists left to fend for themselves as the creatures they'd been working on woke up. At the same time, Parker confronts Jessica on the bridge, just before she initiates the ship's self-destruct sequence, and is joined by Raymond, who survived the shot due to his bulletproof vest. Jessica takes a shot at the pair, injuring Parker, before taking the chance to hit the self-destruct and escaping. The BSA agents are forced to escape the ship and leave behind much of the evidence against Lansdale, but not before fighting off a massive mutated whale that has stalked the waters around the ship. With the Queen Zenobia destroyed, O'Brien has one last gambit against Lansdale, the Queen Dido. After discovering its wreck near Tiergregia, Joe and Chris dive down to find any evidence they can, finding the remains of several FBC teams along the way. During their search, the pair see traces of the horrific fate that befell the Veltro soldiers. Trapped in a sunken ship with limited air, they took the T-Abyss virus in an attempt to survive, with most ultimately succumbing to their mutations. The blobs swimming around the wreck are the mutated forms of these Veltro soldiers. However, there was one last holdout of the Veltro group, the one that had fended off the FBC soldiers sent by Lansdale, Jack Norman. Almost completely losing his mind, his only drive was revenge against Lansdale, desperately guarding the evidence needed to incriminate him. Mistaking Jill and Chris for more FBC agents, he uses the last of the T-Abyss virus and turns into a horrific teleporting monstrosity that requires a keen eye to keep up with its speed and illusions. But eventually, after much struggle, the pair finally put Jack out of his misery and truly destroy Veltro once and for all. And with the evidence they recovered, Lansdale sinks right along with them. I really enjoyed the story of Revelations, with all of its ridiculous twists and deceptions and backstabbings. I like elements like the egotistical Veltro working with and being destroyed by the very corruption they sought to destroy, as well as a headstrong and idealistic rookie like Raymond engaging in questionable acts and deception to bring about justice. If you're considering buying Revelations, I wholeheartedly recommend it. While it has its flaws, it's still an incredibly fun experience that still stands out as unique among both Resident Evil and other horror titles. With that being said, thank you so much for watching, and it would be a huge help if you could hit the Sell Your Soul button down below and ring the bell of doom. Otherwise, I hope you have a nice day.